So recently, the one show that I've been thinking about a lot is Degrassi: The Next Generation, a series that talks about teens' issues. It's ahead of its time, and it does so in a way that doesn't feel very preachy, but at the same time feels very realistic. I've been thinking about one particular storyline that took place in season 4, episode 7, and episode 8, and that is the Time Stands Still storyline. This is probably one of the most well written, if the not best well written episodes of the entire show. And the reason why I say that is because of how it changes the trajectory of particular characters. And so in today's video, we're going to be talking about the context leading up to Time Stands Still, the events of Time Stands Still itself, and how it has affected the following characters: Craig, Sean, and of course Jimmy. But before we get into that, I would just like to introduce or reintroduce myself. Hi, I'm Sassy Critic. I talk about films, television shows, and everything around it. So if that's your thing, hop on for the ride. And what an interesting ride it is, because today we're going to be talking about Time Stands Still, Season 4, Episode 7, and Episode 8 of Degrassi: The Next Generation. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for all the love and support that I've been getting recently. We are at 260 subscribers, which is wild. My next goal is to get to 500 subscribers. So if you are someone who loves long form film and TV show discussions, or you're someone that just likes the quick 1 minute to 2 minute film reviews, this is the channel for you, because we cover it all. But I think we've taken some time in the intro. Let's talk about the context leading up to Time Stands Still. Just before we do continue, I just want to put up a spoiler warning for seasons 1 up to season 4 of Degrassi: The Next Generation. We're going to go into heavy detail of season 4, episode 7 and 8. So if you are not there, or you are thinking of watching that series, you have been warned. I also just want to put up trigger warnings for the following events: for gun violence, alcoholism, etc., etc. I'm going to be listing them all on the screen just so that you guys can see for yourself. So if you feel uncomfortable by these topics, or you get full on triggered, or you feel a sense of anxiety, please feel free to check out my other videos. But with that said, let's get into the events that lead up to Time Stands Still. In order for us to really get into the events that take place in Time Stands Still, parts 1 and 2, we really have to know the context and understand the events leading up to that day. Here is Rick. He kind of comes across as shy and timid, but in reality, he is not. He has a crush on Terry, Terry being one of my favorite characters in the entire show, and the two start to date. The relationship is cute at first, however, it soon turns sour because Rick can be really controlling, and he actually ends up slapping Terry, which leads Terry to breaking up with him. However, that doesn't happen for long, as soon the couple gets back together. And Terry's friends hate this, particularly Paige. Paige does not like the idea of Terry and Rick getting back together. But they do. Terry is convinced that Rick has changed and he is a better person now. So one day, Terry and her friends and their partners, including Rick, they all go on this trip, and Rick and Terry, they go for a walk away from the group. They have this conversation which leads to an argument, and Rick ends up pushing Terry, and Terry's head knocks against a rock, so she has to be sent to the hospital, and she ends up in a coma. So at this point, Terry's friends, especially Paige, hates this. They hate Rick. They hate Rick for what they have done to Terry. After Terry recovers, she ends up going to a different school. So she leaves Degrassi Community School. Right. But here's the thing. Rick is allowed to go back to Degrassi. Now, Mr. Radich, who is now the principal of the school, he explains that because it didn't take place at the school itself, Rick should be allowed to be like any other student and come back to school. So he does. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody likes the idea of Rick returning to Degrassi. Why? Because we have people like Jimmy, Spinner, and Jay literally bullying Rick. So Rick at this point of the series is only really friends with one person, that being Toby. The reason why Toby is at this point isolated at school is because JT, for some reason, decided to not spend time with Toby and instead spend time with Liberty's younger brother Danny at this point of the show. So Toby is alone, Rick is alone, and the two end up being best friends. So Toby and Rick, they end up being on this quiz team along with Emma. And the last person to be recruited is Jimmy Brooks. Now, Jimmy, when Rick rejoined Degrassi, Jimmy did not like that idea and would also join in making fun of Rick. However, Jimmy being Jimmy, he ends up being more mature and is open to the idea of joining the quiz team and being nice to Rick again. Now let's talk about Time Stands Still, Season 4, Episode 7 and 8. So, this particular episode centers around Rick and how he is back at school. He's part of this quiz team along with Emma and Toby and Heather Sinclair. Now, Heather Sinclair had the flu and so she couldn't take part in the quiz, so Jimmy ends up being part of the quiz team instead. So that just provides some of the context that happened in this particular episode. Now, Rick is still being bullied by Jay and by Spinner. Spinner and Jimmy are still on good terms, but for some reason, Spinner has been spending a lot of time with Jay and Alex. And so this particular morning, they make fun of Rick, including Jimmy. Jimmy was also making fun of Rick in that particular episode, but then later on when Jimmy joins the quiz team, he matures and he's open to talking to Rick about being on the quiz. Now, after Rick is being made fun of, Rick takes black spray paint and he goes to Spinner's car and he puts an X by the window. He does the same to Jay's car as well, as a form of revenge of him getting made fun of and bullied at school. Later on in the day, there was the quiz show. It's called Whack a Brain or Whack on a Brain. Anyway, the visuals are going to be up. And this is where we really see Rick thrive in what he is really good at, and that is just having a lot of general knowledge. So, because there was a tie between Degrassi and North High, Rick ends up being the person to answer the questions, and if he answers the most questions correctly, then Degrassi will obviously win the quiz show. So he ends up answering the questions by himself, and when he gets most of those questions correctly, Degrassi ends up winning the competition. But things don't thrive for so long. Why? Because then next thing you know, Rick is being pranked, not just in front of Degrassi and North High students who are supporting them, but also people in people in Canada, because the show is being broadcasted. And he gets pranked on stage. They pour some liquid from the roof that falls on him along with some feathers. And so that really gets to him. He's embarrassed. Some people are laughing. And then the room just goes silent. Rick then goes home because of what happens. And you'd think that he's just going to go home and maybe not return to Degrassi for a long time, but no, he instead goes to his father's cabinet and he takes out a pew-pew. When he puts the pew-pew in the bag, he returns back to Degrassi. Toby sees him and is like, are you sure you really want to be at school after what happened this morning? And Rick says that now would actually be a time where he wants to be at school. So Rick returns back to Degrassi and he first comes across Paige. Now he wants to use the pew pew on Paige, but then Paige comes forward, and remember, up until this point, Paige hated the idea of Rick returning to school. She even made a comment to Rick when he returned back. Like, she was one of those people that wanted to get rid of Rick. But after Rick was being pranked in front of the entire school and possibly in front of the whole of Canada, she changes her mind and she speaks to him in a way that shows a lot of empathy and sympathy. She says that what happened to him was not cool. And so Rick decides that he is not going to use the pew pew on Paige. He then goes to the bathroom, and while he is in the bathroom, Jay and Spinner go in. They realize that Rick is in the bathroom, and so they decide to partially blame Jimmy. Like, they literally blame Jimmy for what happened to Rick. Rick obviously is hearing all of this and instantly believes them. So he is not convinced that Jay and Spinner were the ones that pranked him. He's convinced that Jimmy did. So anyway, Rick ends up in the hallway of the school and he comes across Jimmy. The two of them talk, but then Rick takes out the pew pew, shows it to Jimmy, and Jimmy's like, whoa man, like, you don't have to do this. Jimmy walks away, and when Jimmy walks away, Rick uses the pew pew on Jimmy, and Jimmy is hit in the back from the pew pew. Craig comes around and sees Jimmy, and like, he's obviously being freaked out. He's traumatized by what had just happened. I just want to give a bit of context to Craig in this particular episode. Craig wasn't feeling well, and so his stepfather Joey was like, okay, you gotta stay at home. But later on in the episode, Craig decides he's gonna go to school. And it's that particular day when he ends up at school, he sees Jimmy on the floor being hit by the pew pew by Rick. Rick then decides that he is going to, like, he runs away with the pew pew. He comes across Sean, Emma, and Toby. Now remember, Toby and Rick are best friends. So Toby doesn't want Rick to use the pew pew in the episode, right? But basically what happens is Rick takes out the pew pew, Sean sees it, Sean is trying to get him to not use it because Rick wants to use it on Emma. So earlier on in the episode, Rick thought that Emma loved him, so he went on to try and kiss Emma after they won the competition, but Emma rejects him, and so he's like really mad. So he wants to use the pew pew on Emma. Sean is saying, like, you don't want to do this, you don't want to get violent. And Sean is really the person to talk to Rick about this because Sean knows from his experience, and we're going to get to Sean in detail about why he is the best character to really try and talk Rick down. Sean and Rick end up in a fight, and it's so up close that you can't even see the pew pew, but then it goes off. And then you have Rick and Sean go down. And for a moment, you don't know who is hit. And then later on, we see Sean out of the school. And we get the news that Rick has been unalived with the pew pew. And that Sean accidentally used the pew pew on Rick. So that is the event of Time Stands Still Parts 1 and Parts 2. We are going to be getting into the aftermath of it, mainly on how it affected Sean, Craig, and Jimmy. Now let's talk about each of the characters and how they have been affected by Time Stands Still, starting off with Sean. So for some context, I do have to explain as to why Sean ends up in Degrassi Community School and why he was the best person to talk to Rick. So, Sean actually comes from Wasaga Beach. His father is an alcoholic and his mother cannot find a job. And he ends up in a fight with someone and that results in that person being deaf in one ear. And so Sean ends up going back to Degrassi Community School where he lives with his older brother. When he rejoins Degrassi, he is supposed to be in the same class with Jimmy, with Ellie, Terry, etc., etc., but because he has to be laid back, he ends up in the same class with Emma, Toby, JT, Manny, etc., basically with those kids. So the reason why I'm saying like he is the best person to have spoken to Rick to really calm him down is because Sean really knows the trauma of his like experience back in Wasaga Beach, the fact that he ends up in a fight with someone, the fact that that person ends up being deaf. He really is saying like it's not worth it. Things aren't going to get better after you use the pew pew on people. And so he really tries to calm Rick down. So Sean is really affected by this, but he is in a lot of denial. He doesn't want to talk about the event. He doesn't want to go to the counseling that the school is providing. And even though a lot of the teachers, including Snake, is trying to encourage him to go to counseling and really deal with what had happened to him, because again it's very traumatic. There's going to be a sense of grief, there's going to be a lot of confusion. He is just in denial of that. However, later on in season 4, where we see Sean is watching TV, he sees his father and his mother talk about the incident, and when he sees this he really gets mad, he gets angry, and he's like, nope, I'm gonna go back to Wasaga Beach. So Sean goes back to Wasaga Beach along with Ellie, and he sees the person that he hit that ends up deaf in the one ear. One day when he gets mad, he ends up going like, I don't even know what you call it, but he went onto one of those speedboats. He went to go on those speedboats and he fell off and he almost drowned. But he was saved by the person who he deafened in the one ear. And so the reason why Sean ends up going to Wasaga Beach is because he's mad at his parents for talking out of turn about Sean. Because again, Sean's parents, alcoholics, they don't have a job. They clearly do not know how to take care of their kid, right? So Sean is mad. And when he gets to his parents and he really gets to talk things out with them, he really comes to terms with what happened that day. And he really gets it out. And this was such a well done scene. He eventually talks to his parents and he reconciles with them, and he eventually leaves Degrassi and breaks up with Ellie so that he can be with his parents again. So, of course, Jimmy is the one that was hit by the pew pew that was used by Rick, and because of this, he gets hit in the back and he goes to hospital, and he basically has to use a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The doctors told him that he will never be able to walk again. And so Jimmy is really mad at this. Like, he does not like the idea of being in a wheelchair because he's a basketball player. He's really good, but now he's in a wheelchair. He goes to physiotherapy and he has to do that recurringly, but he won't be able to walk again. He has to use the wheelchair. We know that Jimmy is being affected psychologically by the events in Time Stand Still because of one particular episode. We really get to see how he has nightmares of the event. He dreams like he's walking again, but then he gets attacked by Rick and he's in the wheelchair. So we know that Jimmy is not only traumatized, he's also angry at the circumstances that he is in a wheelchair. We also get to see how Jimmy gets to cope with this and how he really gets through this particular circumstances. So he starts drawing and he starts expressing himself through his art. He draws about the fact that he was attacked by Rick, and all of these sketches turns out to be really good, and this catches the eye of Ellie. So at this point, Jimmy and Hazel are still dating. They dated since the Breakfast Club episode, and they are still dating at this point. But as also at the same time, Jimmy and Ellie are kind of getting closer because of the drawings. And when Hazel realizes that Jimmy is starting to develop feelings for Ellie, she breaks up with him. So that is how Jimmy is affected by Time Stands Still. Now let's talk about Craig Manning and how he has been affected by Time Stands Still. So in order for us to really get into it, we have to give some context for Craig Manning. So Craig was introduced in season 2 of Degrassi: The Next Generation, and we see him taking a picture of a little girl. This little girl is Angie, or rather Angela. Angela is Craig's baby sister, or rather his half sister. You see, Angela and Craig's mother married both Craig's father when then they got divorced, and so Craig's mother ends up marrying Joey Jeremiah and then having a baby named Angela. I hope I explained this clearly. Anyway, so Craig, he takes pictures of his baby sister, but it's clear that he's doing it in a way in which he doesn't get caught. Once Joey sees him, he runs back home. He's supposed to be home by like 6 o'clock, but he's a bit late. And instead of the father being understanding or maybe like giving like a light punishment, the father is seen to be quite abusive towards Craig. And Craig ends up having bruises on his abdomen. Through Emma, because Craig and Emma know each other, he's able to see his sister again and he spends time with her. But then his baby sister sees the bruises on his abdomen and it's like, oh, but dinosaur bites. And that's what he explains to her, so that's what she says to Joey when she gets home. When Joey realizes what is happening, he also just wants for Craig and for Angela to have a bond. So he does try to get through to Craig's father, but Craig's father is like very rude and just like leaves. But once Joey finds out about the bruises on Craig's body, he tries to find Craig. So Craig and Sean, they go to a train track and, they kind of have a heart-to-heart. They go walking on this train track, but then a train is coming and Sean gets out of the way, but Craig sort of just stands there. And so Sean has to like save him and tug him, pushes him out of the way rather, and make sure that he is safe. When this happens, it's like we really get to see into the psyche of Craig. Joey finds out how Craig is being abused, and so Craig ends up living with Joey. This is all going to lead up to something, I swear. I just have to back up when it comes to Craig because he's a very much well-developed character. So he ends up living with Joey, and he gets to obviously spend more time with his little sister. During this time, though, his father is trying to get in contact with him, and he does. So Craig and his father goes on like a little dinner evening, and his father is basically saying like, look, I would love for you to move back in with me. And he says, oh, I've changed, that sort of thing. But Craig is not convinced. He walks away. And it doesn't end well. Craig's father drives off and Craig goes home. The next morning, we find out that Craig's father dies in a car accident. So Craig has to deal with the grief of the loss of his father, which was already a very complicated relationship because of how abusive his father was to him, like hitting him, bashing down doors, breaking his camera, so on and so forth. Later on in the series, we get like a love triangle between Craig, Manny, and Ashley, and I'm just gonna say I do not have the time and energy to go through that whole love triangle, so just know that at some point he cheated on Ashley with Manny, and then at some point he wants to be with Manny, but he also wants to be with Ashley. It's a mess. It's a mess. I would suggest trying finding another video on YouTube that talks about that whole debacle. But the point that I wanted to make was because of all the events leading up to Time Stand Still, and then also how it affects Craig. It's more than just the Time Stand Still events. It's everything leading up to it when it comes to Craig. Craig is, of course, the person being the one who sees Jimmy after he had been attacked by Rick. Alright, so at this point, Craig and Joey are living, he's living with Joey. And at this point, he's dating Ashley. Now, Ashley's dad is engaged. Ashley's dad came out as gay and he has a partner, so he's going to get married. And so Craig and Ashley, they basically get a hotel room. They get together for the first time, but he uses Joey's card. And when he proposes to Ashley, Ashley says no. She says that she's actually moving to London. He wrecks the hotel room. Okay. So after that particular event, that's in season 4, episode 11, that's when we find out that Craig has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. The reason why I wanted to mention all of those events leading up to Time Stand Still itself, and then of course what happens with Ashley, is because all those events lead up to Craig's diagnosis of bipolar because of how he had been reacting to certain events, and of course all the trauma and his thoughts, his behavior, all of that. It leads up to his diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Craig is probably one of my favorite characters when it comes to the show because he's very complex, he's well written, and yes, even though he annoyed me with the fact that he couldn't decide which woman he wanted to be with, he still ends up being one of the best characters in the series, in my opinion. Time Stands Still Parts 1 and 2 really prove to be an impactful set of episodes as it changes the trajectory of some of the main characters in the show. Characters such as Craig, Sean, and of course Jimmy Brooks have their stories go in wildly different directions because of what happens in Time Stands Still. Time Stands Still is probably one of my favorite episodes because of how well written that episode was. Now, when it comes to what happened to Rick, my thoughts on Rick as a character is that I don't like him. He's my least favorite character in the entire show, and I just don't like him. I hated the fact that him and Terry got back together as a couple. But at the same time, I really felt sorry for him. I genuinely felt sorry for him when people at Degrassi were bullying him and making fun of him. It would have been best for Rick to not return to Degrassi. It would have been best for him to maybe just like go to a different school and really go to some sort of anger management or therapy to really just change the way he behaves with people, how he treats people, and how he talks to them, because it's very clear that even though he returns to Degrassi and he gets made fun of and bullied, he still takes out the spray paint and he sprays it on Spinner's car, on Spinner and Jay's car in the series. So there's a part of me that sort of feels sorry for Rick because of how badly he's being treated when he returns to Degrassi. But on the other hand, I just really dislike him as a character, and he shouldn't have returned to Degrassi at all. But those are just my thoughts on Time Stands Still. Thank you so much for joining me in this video. I really had a ton of fun just going through the details of it. It really just gave me the opportunity to re-watch season 4 episodes 7 and 8, which is really good because again I love those episodes, and it also just gave me an excuse to read through Craig Manning's profile and where he ends up in the show. I really do love that class of 2006 and 2007. I do like the class of 2011 and maybe the class of 2013 and 2014. That would be Holly J, Sav, um, and then 2013 would of course be Eli, and 2014 would of course be Claire. But I just feel like nothing really beats the class of 2006 and 2007 in my opinion. But anyway, we're gonna have to get to another video when it comes to that. But thank you so much for joining me on this. If you have made it this far in the video, please feel free to put a thumbs up. Also, if you love TV show and film discussions, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you do not miss a video. I try and post videos every single Friday, so be sure that you check that out. And now and then I do post a bonus video in the week so that I can just surprise you guys. So whether you're someone who loves your long form content or your short form reviews, this is the channel for you. Also, comment down below what you think of Time Stand Still. Who do you think was most affected by the events that happened in this episode? Who is your favorite character? Who's your least favorite character? I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments. But with all of that being said, until next time, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!